Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special Yahoo News virtual town hall on food security and the coronavirus crisis. I'm Dan Kleidman, editor-in-chief of Yahoo News.
And I'm Brittany Shepard, Yahoo News national political reporter. We are pleased to welcome Vice President Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, and Jose Andres, world-renowned chef, restaurateur, humanitarian, and founder of World Central Kitchen.
One of the things we have all learned about a pandemic is the world has to cope with far more than just the disease itself, from the collapse of the global economy to the safety of our healthcare workers. But food holds a unique place in this crisis. Disruptions to the food supply chain means that for the first time in memory, parts of the country could face shortages. Lines at some food banks are miles long. And while food workers are on the front lines of responding to the crisis, many of them are in low-wage jobs and face significant medical risk. Tonight, we'll hear how they're playing a crucial and often heroic role in providing solutions to America in this difficult time. So, Mr. Vice President and Chef, to kick off the conversation, I want to ask both of you what the coronavirus crisis has revealed about the state of food insecurity in the United States and around the world. Mr. Vice President, why don't you start?
Well, it's revealed that it's very fragile. It's revealed that it affects, the virus affects the whole range of things. It affects the production workers who don't have the protective gear to take care of themselves. And it affects the ability to get product to market. It affects the ability of people to actually, with all these jobs lost, to be able to go out and actually have the money to pay for a meal, to pay for their groceries. It also shows you, when I said I was announcing for president, I said I wanted to restore the soul of America. Well, we're seeing the soul of America. We're seeing these workers, many of whom work at some at sub-minimum wage. They're out there busting their neck, making sure that, and taking chances on their lives to make sure that we are able to have the ability to eat, the ability to continue to survive. They're carrying us on their backs. They are the soul of America. And you have the chef. Chef Andre here is doing an incredible job, feeding millions of people, making sure that he get this thing done. Chef, you're a real inspiration. You're a game changer. Much is needed to have this win-win and food insecurity. Americans are hard hit. Restaurant workers, I've always believed there's no problem we can't solve if we do it together. And you're living proof of that, Chef. And you're nourishing the nation.
Well, I'm going to bring the chef in just a second. I just want to ask you one quick follow-up. Sure. What kinds of changes to food policy do we need now and will we need going forward to prepare ourselves for the next crisis?
Well, first of all, the president should stop trying to cut the SNAP program, which is essentially the food stamp program. In the middle of this crisis, he is, in fact, cutting food stamps. He wants to cut the access to food stamps, or SNAP as it's known as. Mm-hmm. Number two, not getting the protection that the workers need in the production plants, from the meatpacking plants all across the board. They don't have the gear. They don't have the masks. They don't have the gloves. They don't have the need and the separation needed to protect them. They don't even have the, OSHA, which is the safety standards are set up by the administration, by the federal government. Those standards have been weakened and lessened. People are getting, they're getting laid off by the millions. People don't have the money to be able to stay, to be able to take care of everything from their rent to their food needs. And thirdly, what's happening is all the money that the Congress has passed to help people in this dire need, it's not going to the right people. It's not getting to those mom and pop stores. It's not getting to people who need to be able to pay workers to stay on a payroll. It's not getting to people who need relief. And so it's just not being done very well at all.
Chef, I'm going to let you answer some of those policy questions because I know you're passionate about them. But let me just start by asking you this. You and your organization, World Central Kitchen, have leapt into action to respond to this crisis, much like you have after earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes, tsunamis, you name it. Tell us what your organization has been doing, what you have seen and learned by having boots on the ground, and how do you even do food relief in the midst of a pandemic?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for having me here with you. I feel honored. What I'm going to say is that World Central Kitchen was created over 10 years ago after the earthquake that hit Haiti, Port-au-Prince so badly. And there I saw the opportunity to bring food to the table. When you need medical care, you send doctors. When you need reconstruction, you send engineers and architects. When you need to provide food for people in need, we should be sending cooks. And that's very much what we've been doing. Since this pandemic began, the men and women of World Central Kitchen, we began responding to Yokohama when the Princess cruise ship was badly hit by coronavirus. We were there over a month helping the Japanese government to feed the many people on that boat. In that moment, we realized that this was going to be hitting home. And we understood by watching what was happening in China, in Asia, in Italy, what was happening in Europe, in Spain, that we had to have a food game, because at the end of the day, that's what World Central Kitchen does. So we began getting ready to answer to the call. We knew that people were going to be losing jobs. We knew that some food systems were going to be breaking, and we positioned ourselves to make sure that we were going to be there to respond to the many issues that we were going to be facing. Today, we are about to reach 10 million meals. We are in Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, we're in Colombia, Venezuela, we are in Spain, where I come from. And at the end of the day, we don't plan, we don't mean. We don't plan, we don't meet. What we do is we adapt to the situation. And this moment requires a lot of adaptation. So very proud to be having the entire food community in a moment that the restaurants of America, they've been shut down, to bring that food community to make sure that no America will go home hungry.
I know that Brittany has a follow-up to this, but I want to ask you, since you've been on the ground, what have you learned about federal preparedness or the lack thereof by going into these hard-hit communities? What have you learned about how the federal government responded to these kinds of issues?
I do believe that we need to start taking food seriously once and for all. Food needs to be treated as a national security issue. After 9/11, we created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Many people will say that was a good decision. I do believe more than ever, we do need a National Director of Food and Nutrition sitting next to the president and being a member of the NSC, the National Security Council. Why? Because if we take food for granted, one day we will see problems. Right now, we see those problems. We had already almost 40 million Americans that they were somehow food insecure. All of a sudden, we have so many more million that they are being added to the unemployment list. All of a sudden, we have 50, 60, 70 million Americans that they're going to be having an issue of knowing where they're going to be feeding their families. So this is what the system is showing up. I agree with Mr. Vice President on the SNAPs. I think we actually need to increase the SNAPs, because if it's a moment to be making sure that Americans are fed, is in this biggest crisis that our nation has faced in years. We need to make sure that the SNAPs, we use the technology to actually, why you cannot be using SNAPs to take your family with respect to a coffee shop or a diner in your community. Federal dollars helping the local economy and making sure that Americans are fed. Why Americans right now that maybe they shouldn't be going out, like elderly, they cannot use SNAPs to buy food online, so we keep elderly Americans safe? Why we don't use SNAPs to make sure we increase the quantity of fruits and vegetables in the farmers markets that they can buy, so we can have a healthier America in the process of making sure that our farmers that right now are throwing food out, they have a place to be putting that food forward. At the end of the day, SNAPs is our national defense against poverty. We need to make sure that we support the SNAPs and we come up with the smart ideas to make sure that they are put to help the American people to have food on the table. So food is the solution and not part of the problem.
Dan, can I add something to that if it's appropriate?
Absolutely.
You know, I want to make clear to all your listeners that we don't have a food shortage problem. We have a leadership problem. We have plenty of food. It's being plowed under. You're euthanizing cattle and pigs. They're out there making sure that they're pouring thousands of gallons of milk under the ground. It's not a food shortage, it's a lack of leadership, And the leadership goes across the board. One of the reasons why those processing plants aren't open is because they're not safe for people to work in those plants. Number one, they're not safe. They're not getting the protective gear they need. Number two, one of the reasons why we're not getting material and food to people's tables is because there's no way to get it transported to there. We don't know how to manage what's going on. For example, imagine if we were to say to the country that tell all those milk producers that just send all that milk to the bottling plant. The federal government will pay for it, and the federal government will give it away to all of the folks who need it. We'll give it away to all those charitable organizations who are out there trying to feed people, try to give people what they need. Imagine if we were willing to take the time. I mean, we have the best agricultural system in the world. It's the leadership that's we can't afford to let people go wondering where they're going to get their next meal. And so right now, hunger today isn't about scarcity; it's about massive failure in leadership. And we got to. And look, he could have ordered the president could have ordered the government to buy food from farmers and send it to food banks, but he failed to step up. He refused to protect food workers and health safety. Thousands of meat packer workers got sick, got the virus, and some died. If I were president today, what I would do, I would be protecting farm meat packers, farm workers, food suppliers. I'd boost the SNAP program. I'd harness the restaurant industry to help get food to those who need it and help get millions of laid off workers back to work and the job. That's what the chef's doing. This is not rocket science. It's leadership and it's organization.
And Mr. Vice President, and we're going to get to the details of PPP and what's happening in those meat factories in just a little bit.
I'm sorry.
No, of course. No, please. I'm happy that you're spirited. But I do want to touch on, federal preparedness. For, a long time, you've been critical of the Trump administration's handling of coronavirus writ large, from testing to availability of masks. But I'm curious how you would rate the Trump administration's handling of food security specifically.
It's been counterproductive. Not productive, it's been counterproductive. He was warned early on about the meatpacking plants. He was warned early on about the fact that all he had to do was he seems to watch a lot of television. All he had to do was turn on the television, watch 2 miles and hours of people waiting in line to get food, just to be able to eat, to see all those people lined up when withering cold. I went to one of the food banks and kids are waiting for the horn to go off. The tables are about 100 yards long of all the food that's available in the food banks. And they're waiting there, and it's like a siren goes off. They run and grab their box, and they start down the aisle to get. I was handing out bread. It just happened to be. And I asked one little kid, I said, take another one, honey. He said, no, someone else may need it. Somebody else may need it. I mean, come on. What are we doing? The richest country in the world, the most productive agricultural country in the world. And what are we doing? Except deciding that we're going to make people who get the SNAP program work for it. They don't get to qualify unless they work, have a job. What job? What job? And God, we've already lost 90,000 people dead. And the number's going up. I'm sorry. There's so much more you could talk about, but it's just not been. The president has refused to acknowledge his responsibility. He's refused to acknowledge that anything went wrong. Turn on the television today, and guess what? Everything's going fine, man. We're in great shape. We have all the tests we need to make people be able to go back to work safely. Don't worry about it. I don't need a mask. I got my mask. I can't walk outside my house because the Secret Service out there, they're all wearing their masks. They're all getting tested. Come on. It's irresponsible.
And I want to push in a little bit more about the perceived irresponsibility. We at Yahoo News reported earlier this year that in the beginning of April, the federal government food supply chain task force warned that personal protective equipment, what we call PPE, running out in these food processing facilities could that shortages of meat could occur in 2 to 4 weeks. They knew this in April. And we've now seen shortages of meats in grocery stores, rising prices. You can't get a burger at Wendy's if you wanted one. And given that there was advance notice, is this an example of a failure of federal leadership? What do you think that could have been done to prevent this from happening?
It's overwhelming. Look, the president has refused to acknowledge, number one, he has responsibility. It's not my fault. I take no responsibility for whatever it is. Then he just stands up and tells untruths. He says, we're in good, everything's going fine. This coronavirus is going to go away and with the weather. It's going to be like a miracle. Back in look, if I can talk about the Intelligence Committee for just a second, the community. They had 10 what they call presidential daily briefs. They call them PDBs, where the intelligence community said to the president, and in writing, I don't know whether you read it or listened, that this was a pandemic that was coming, had to prepare. That was way back in January. On January, the third week in January, I wrote an article for USA Today saying a pandemic is on our doorstep. We have to act. President said he had no responsibility, did nothing. All the way down. He has the power under the Defense Production Act to turn to any operation and say, make me 1 million masks. Look how long it took him to get the ventilator thing going. Why is he unwilling to use the power he had? I don't get it. I truly don't get it, except that he thinks that government doesn't work. Government is useless. If you think government is useless, I guess you deny responsibility. You have any responsibility. You know, he should have a director in chief as where all these needs are. Somebody like a commander that's going to know exactly where the needs are. The same thing should be happening with food right now. Where are the shortages? How do we get them to the people who need them? It's a federal responsibility.
Chef Andres, do you share the Vice President's frustration?
I will say that in moments like this, the people is what always wins the day. And I know Mr. Vice President always has belief in we, the people. Mr. Vice President spoke about the meat processing plants. I will request anybody in a position of leadership that the lessons learned from the past are a must to understand problems that may happen in the present and show us how we should be learning from those lessons of the past to have a good response into the future. Everybody should be reading Upton Sinclair, a book that was published, an author that published this book, The Jungle, in 1906. Every American should read The Jungle. The Jungle very much was talking about how the meat processing plants were treating their employees and how many were immigrants, many undocumented, and the conditions under which they were working, that they were not the right ones, over 100 years, and how the meat was not being produced in a good way. Obviously, in a pandemic, is showing us the weaknesses of our system. Cannot be that this pandemic is showing us that the workers, the employees, the Americans in charge of feeding America are getting sick in the process of feeding America. So this is a big lesson learned that we need to be taking food as a national security issue. And that's why diversifying food sources is going to be something I'm going to be asking President Trump and Mr. Vice President Biden, if he makes it to the White House, that by diversifying the food sources and making sure that the food production doesn't rely on the hands of the few, but that we are able to have an America that is stronger on the food department by having enough meat producers at the local level, enough chicken producers, enough farmers. These will be the way to make sure that thousands of employees, thousands of Americans don't get sick in the process of producing meats that America needs to keep feeding our great country. So on that sense, yes, I agree with him that we need to be taking food seriously in a pandemic, more seriously than ever, because we cannot take food for granted.
Jose,
you go back to Upton Sinclair and talk about the safety of workers. I've been to those meatpacking plants. They are brutal. They are brutal. The people who work in them in good days, good times. It's a high rate of injury. It's a difficult job. We have in the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, where I live, down that peninsula, we have a $5 billion industry in chickens. We have chicken hangars. Go into one of those places where it's the equivalent of a meatpacking plant on a smaller scale in terms of what you do. And guess what? There's a thing we set up a long time ago, OSHA, Operational Safety and Health Organization. Well, what happens? What we have not enforced the regulations. We've deregulated. What's happened is those whatever it is, whether it's cattle, whether it's beef, whether it's pigs, whether it's chicken, they're moving down the line faster and faster and faster to increase the profit rate. People are getting sicker and sicker and sicker. People are getting hurt. The very thing we should be doing now is making sure these people are protected, that they have space 6 feet apart, that they have shields around them, slow the process up, make sure they have the protective gear, make sure they are being taken care of. Increase the number of those plants that are available to us so that we can, in fact, get the food out. Keep meatpacking plants open. To keep them open, the way to keep them open is to keep workers healthy. The way to keep workers healthy is to give them the protection they need and enforce basic health and safety guidelines.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Vice President, let me ask you, just following up on that, if we regulate these meat processing plants more aggressively, if we add new regulations, you're going to drive up the price of meat. And so I guess the question is that a bargain we should ask the American people to make? One follows the other.
Absolutely, positively. No worker's life is worth my getting a cheaper hamburger. No worker's life's worth that. That's what the hell's happened here. There used to be a basic bargain in America. If you participated in the enterprise that made a profit, you got to share in that profit. If it made a loss, you shared in the loss. What is it today? We don't treat the workers well at all across the board. You'd think Milton Friedman was running everything these days. He's, God rest his soul. The idea that we have obligations to workers, we have obligations to the community. Yes, yes, yes.
But if those prices go up, then Chef, you're going to have to pass those costs along to your customers. Is that going to affect the viability of your restaurants?
It's not about how expensive or how cheap food is. Food has to have the right price. Right now, the way our farm bill works, we're subsidizing certain segments of our food production, and others that we need more, like fruits and vegetables, are not having the same opportunity and the benefits of being subsidized by the federal government. By subsidizing corn, all of a sudden, yes, we're able to produce beef that we can put and create hot dogs and burgers that they are super cheap. And so America keeps eating every day, and the world, more food, more meat, more burgers. I have no problem with eating a burger. I love it. I don't have a problem with a hot dog. I had one amazing hot dog yesterday in Chicago. But what we cannot be just doing is making America sick in the way of feeding America. And what we cannot be doing either in the way of producing food, we are contaminating America. We need to start having a policy, a food policy that is in the best interest of America, of having healthy Americans. Remember that the school lunch program was passed in 1945, 1946, because the Pentagon, the military, couldn't add young Americans because they were underfed. Today, we have generals and admirals in what is called Operation Readiness that they are requesting the federal government to invest money in the school lunch program again to feed those children that right now are obese, and so they cannot join the military. It's a national security issue. We need to feed America in the right way. And our food policy needs to be one that protects the people that produce those meals, those meats, those sausages, those burgers, that also protects the environment. And at the end, the right price is what is going to be showing up. Cheap food at the expense of unhealthy workers, and all of a sudden an ecosystem that is deteriorating every day. I don't think any American I know want that. They want a good America that is a clean America, that is a healthy America. And so we can keep looking at the future with good food, one plate of food at a time. We can be changing fundamentally how healthy America will be.
Jose, I want to talk about the role that restaurants are playing in this crisis, but just a quick follow-up to something that the Vice President said a moment ago. Vice President Biden, you talked about all of these PDBs that the President was getting, warning about this pandemic coming. And I wonder if you think that this was an intelligence failure, really on the scale of the 9/11 intelligence failure. After all, as you pointed out, 90,000 Americans are dead.
Was it the president's intelligence that failed? You mean
No,
him?
I'm
his
asking
IQ?
you. Yeah.
Well,
I'm
look,
asking-
the president, no, the intelligence community didn't fail. They told him. They said, here's the deal. That's all they can do. They can't make the orders. They
Right, but-
said to the president. They didn't fail. The
I'm
president
talking about this
failed.
being a presidential, a White House intelligence failure. They warned him, but the point is, you said he ignored those warnings. So
He
isn't
either
that an
didn't
intelligence
read them,
failure?
he didn't either read them or he ignored them, both of which is a dereliction of his duty. Think about it. If someone came to me, and I'm president of the United States, and I've been to more presidential daily briefings than he has because I was there for 8 years, and the intelligence community says, this is about to happen and lays out for me evidence of why it's happening, and they do it on 10 occasions, and I don't pay any attention to it. I don't pay any attention to it. Look what happened. And again, it wasn't just the intelligence community. I knew what was happening. I wrote an article back in January. I pushed him a couple months ago to use the power he has as president of the United States under the Defense Production Act to be able to get things done when there's a crisis in America. The idea that there was no crisis, and even now, President says, "Don't worry, we're fine. We're fine. We get all the tests we need. Anybody can get a test who want one. Go try to get one. Go try to get one. Come on. This is about presidential responsibility. You got to tell the truth. You got to tell the truth." And all he wants to do, he's so worried that the Dow is going to drop, which it has. That's his measure. That's his holy grail. And that's all he cares about. And look, the Dow is important. I don't discount that. But it's about how's he going to run? He's got to get that Dow up. And in his mind. But you can't just completely separate the health side from the job side. They're a consequence. They're together. They have to be handled together.
Jose, restaurants are experiencing a calamity right now. 5.5 million jobs lost in April alone. And yet you see the restaurant industry as an integral part of the solution to the food security crisis right now and into the future. So talk about that.
Well, again, I said that we've been at World Central Kitchen 96 days fighting and providing food in this pandemic. But very quickly, we saw that as restaurants were closing, well, by the owner's decision, or well, because our governors and mayors mandate us to close, I realized that we had to keep some restaurants open because at the end of the day was going to be a lot of need. So what World Central Kitchen has been doing is we are on our way to adding 1,600, 1,700 restaurants that they are in our team all across the nation, where we are doing something very simple, and we're sending a message to Congress and to the White House. If we have restaurants that they are not right now working and active, but we are the best people to feed Americans that are in need, why we don't put restaurants up and running to produce foods at the local level that we can handle the local problems well, taking care of hospitals, nurses and doctors, elderly homes, homeless shelters, police, firefighters, whatever is a need. We have the restaurants right there in partnership with World Central Kitchen. All of a sudden, we are doing over 300,000 meals a day. I've been proposing this since I began writing an op-ed in the New York Times and the Washington Post, that actually Governor Newsom in California, using the Stafford Act, was in partnership with FEMA, federal dollars, in supporting the governor. The governor is trying to be activating restaurants to be feeding elderly in California. That's what World Central Kitchen has been doing. And we have right now in Congress a bill that is called the FEED Act, which actually I know Mr. Vice President, he loves bipartisanship more than anybody I know. This bill is being passed at Congress with bipartisan support. Congressman Thompson, Congressman Davis from Illinois, Congressman McGovern, co-signed by Congressman Hurt of Texas, and at the same time is support already in the Senate. by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina and Senator Kamala Harris. And I think Senator Warner is also going to be supporting it, and Senator Boozman from Tennessee. All of a sudden, we have a simple idea that we are already proving Congress that works to put restaurants at work, giving hope to the restaurant community, feeding the communities are in need, and getting ready for one day when we can open for good in the next weeks or the next few months, that the restaurants are already part of the solution. So the FEED Act, I hope, will pass. And I hope, Mr. Vice President, I know this is the type of ideas he likes to support. And this is the way we should keep feeding America. We need a 360 degree. It's not only SNAPs, it's not only food banks, it's not only the FEED Act through restaurants, it's not only the school lunch program. We need to make sure that Congress supports all those programs. So, shorter lines and longer tables. This way, we diversify the food production of America, we diversify the food output of America. All of a sudden, nobody has to be on a line waiting for a plate of food. We don't have to make people feel pity. We need to show people respect. The best way to show respect to the American people is make sure that food not be a problem during this pandemic.
Chef, I agree with you, and I support the program, but let's get something straight here so people aren't confused. You're not talking about opening restaurants and having crowded restaurants and people looking at each other across the table with 35, 40 people in a small room. What your program does is you provide these meals. You get the money to what the Congress did when they passed the CARES Act. What they said was, we're going to give money to small businesses and restaurants to keep their employees employed. And the way that the chef is doing it is, for every meal they produce, he is providing roughly $10 per meal that they're getting paid for, and then they're taking it to the people in need. But there's not people in the restaurant sitting at all those tables staying open. But guess what? The restaurant stays open and the workers have a job and they're getting paid. And we're providing for the needs of people who most need it now, so that there'll be something to go to when this pandemic is over, when we finally get a vaccine, when we finally shut down this coronavirus. But in the meantime, it's not talking about people opening the restaurants. That's not what Gavin Newsom has done. Gavin Newsom has said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that we have the federal government pay for a lot of this food, buy it, give it to these organizations that, in fact, including restaurants, keeping people open, and charitable organizations and all these outfits that are the food banks, so they can feed people. By the way, the school lunch program, the people need to be fed. These kids need to be fed, but they're not being fed in the restaurant. They're having it taken to them. That's why it's being delivered. That's another cost engaged that the federal government should be paying for. So look, this feed program, this feed act pays restaurants to hire back their workers to make meals that their nonprofit partners will get into their hands for people who are hungry. But I want to make it clear, it's not about saying we're ready to open all restaurants now. That's not the Tony Fauci's and the leaders, the scientific community say we should be doing now. But we can keep people employed.
100% agree. And Mr. Vice President, I love it because you know the FEED Act better than I know, and I've been working on that one very well. So thank you very much for explaining it in the right way to the American people.
Well, Chef Andres, too, want to touch on something that the Vice President brought up. I think a lot of people are wondering what the restaurant experience is going to be like when things go, quote unquote, back to normal, though I would also hazard that I don't think normal really exists anymore. You own a lot of restaurants, and I guess I have two questions. One, what does a Jose Andres restaurant, let's say in DC, make it real for us, look like in the next coming months once things relax? And even if your restaurants are participating in creating meals for other people, how can you expect these mom and pop restaurants, or basically all of the DC restaurants, seem to follow suit? What if they don't?
Well, this is a great question. Obviously, we are all in the restaurant community thinking about what is going to be our world looking like tomorrow. I do believe that restaurants are part of the DNA of America. The melting pot of America is more than 650,000 restaurants that feed America every single day. And I know everybody that is watching us right now, they have their favorite restaurants. They have the restaurants that they went the first time when they were a little boy, a little girl. The restaurants that you bring your grandmother to celebrate her birthday. We all are attached to our community in more ways than one, to restaurants. So right now we need to be doing what the Vice President has said. We need to be following the guidance of our health experts. I love to listen to Dr. Fauci and listen what his guidance is. My business side tells me one thing: I want to open tomorrow, but at the same time, I cannot be opening tomorrow at the expense of putting my teams in danger, the guests in danger, and my city in danger, and our country in danger. So we need to follow the guidance of that. But I do believe that for some time, until we really have control of this virus, we're going to keep the distance in the restaurants. Right now is conversations. I'm sitting in the advisory board of Mayor Bowser of Washington, D.C., and quite frankly, it's not easy. We're talking about starting outside to make sure that the restaurants can be using the streets to be putting tables there and doing service. When we open inside, we're going to have to keep distance. We're talking 25, 50%. It's going to be a challenge for the restaurants to be profitable under this new moment. We don't know how many months this is going to last. That's why it's very important that restaurants that employ millions of Americans, and indirectly we employ many more, because thanks to restaurants, we need to remember that more than 90% of the money that comes, every dollar that comes into the restaurant goes out, paying employees, paying farmers, paying fishermen, paying taxes. The restaurant money just goes across the community. So we are going to need to make sure that besides the PPP that Congress has passed, which is a good idea that needs still some fixing and implementation, better implementation, so really can be helping the small business and the restaurant community, we're going to need a fund to reopen those restaurants. Because if not, I believe that many small business owners, and especially in my world, small restaurants, they're going to have a hard time reopening, because they're going to be lacking the funds to start buying again food, to start buying again all the things that you need to put your restaurants ready to this new coronavirus era we are living. So I hope that in the month to come, or sooner rather than later, that we're going to be supported by money that is going to help the small businesses to reopen again. If not, many are not going to be making it, because the load of being closed for so many weeks, so many months, is going to be too much for them to handle.
You're dead right. The Congress has passed a $60 billion small business Main Street loan program a couple months ago. Not one penny has gone out yet. Not one. It's not to open the restaurant. It's to make sure they can pay their rent, make sure they can keep their people on their payroll, make sure they can continue to be there. So when they are able to open, they are there. They are not out of business. It's not happening. Look where the money's going. The president has fired every IG, they call it, every inspector general. I had the job of getting out $84 billion in 18 months in the Recovery Act. We had an inspector general I work with once a week to look at everything we did, exactly where the money went, who got the money, who was responsible for it, and how it was being spent. So we kept an eye on it. This president has fired every inspector general that the Congress set up to see to it that this money was going where it was supposed to get. Ride down to Main Street now, in any town. My father-in-law was a restaurateur, and a very successful one. He had the largest diner, a 24-hour diner in Auburn, New York. He did the community college. He had a number of restaurants around the region and was very successful. And by the way, he tried to bribe me to stay in Syracuse, and so I wouldn't go back and practice law in Delaware, offering me one of the restaurants. I watched how hard he worked. It was too hard. I wasn't going to do it. But my generic point is this: they have to have daily operating capacity. They have to be able to pay their employees. They have to keep them on the payroll. That's the money that Congress passed to allow them to do that, and it's only gone out to big businesses. It's only gone out to, and what I'm going to do if I'm elected president, I'm going to hire an inspector general. We're going to have one on staff and go back and look where every single dollar went that was designed to keep employees employed. And you're going to find where it went. It went to an awful lot of big operations. Not one single penny should be going to a multinational corporation to buy back their stock or to give a stock break. It's irrelevant. What we need now is to keep small businesses open so when this breaks, they're still there.
Mr. Vice President, I think that's a good point to move and pivot to some other topics that are very much in the news. I'm glad you brought up Inspector General. And Jose, feel free to weigh in too as you see fit. So Vice President Biden, I'm going to start with you. This week, President Trump announced that he is taking hydroxychloroquine as a prophylactic. I'm sure you saw the news, right? But there's growing evidence linking hydroxychloroquine to dangerous side effects. And I'm curious how you feel about the President of the United States modeling what many doctors view as risky medical behavior in front of the American people.
It's like saying maybe if you injected Clorox into your blood, it may cure you. Come on, man. What is he doing? What in God's name is he doing? And the things that presidents say, the words of a president matter. When the president says you heard the vice president today or yesterday say, I'm not using it. I'm not using it. The vice president of the United States. Look, this is absolutely irresponsible. There's no serious medical personnel out there saying to use that drug. It's counterproductive. It's not going to help. But the president, he decided that's an answer. So what do you think people are going to be doing? You think they're not going to use it? And look at the studies that have been done. It does much more harm than good. This is totally irresponsible. Totally irresponsible.
Vice President Biden, you mentioned the president firing inspectors general. The latest one, the White House announced that the inspector general of the State Department, at the request of Secretary Pompeo, would be gone. Democrats are pretty steamed about that. Would you pledge right now that you will not fire any inspectors general if you were president? Or I guess another way of asking that is would you back congressional efforts to restrict the executive branch's ability to unilaterally oust inspectors?
Yes. The idea, inspector generals were designed to make government honest, to keep it honest. It's a gigantic government. We have thousands of employees. It's part of a troubling pattern since this whole COVID crisis began. Trump firing nonpartisan officials, firing oversight roles created by Congress. A guy who decides now that because the inspector general may have been, the rumor is, may have been in looking at something that wasn't proper that the Secretary of State did in terms of dealing with Saudi Arabia. I mean, come on.
But, I've got to point out that early in his term, President Obama fired the AmeriCorps Inspector General, Gerald Walpin, who was reportedly investigating one of his political supporters. In retrospect, was that a mistake?
I don't recall that, but I tell you what, I don't ever remember the president deciding that somebody being investigated was inappropriate.
And, Mr. Vice President, I want to bring us online a little bit because there's been lots of activity. The president, by our count, has tweeted the word Obamagate in all caps at least a dozen times. I'm curious what goes through your mind when you see those tweets and what your response is. And when he makes it's very personal attack when he says that Obamagate was the greatest political crime in American history.
This is his pattern. Diversion. Don't speak to whatever the issues before us are. My God, Obamagate. And he also, by the way, just said, I read that he is not going to allow the President Obama's picture to be hung in the White House as long as he's president. That's another inducement for him to make sure he's not president beyond January 20th. Come on. This is so venal, so petty. The greatest crime? I mean, my Lord. This is,
Well, to go into that even more extremes, both of his sons over the weekend insinuated that children should feel unsafe around you, which at least to me seemed reminiscent of outlandish Pizzagate pedophilia allegations leveled at Hillary Clinton's campaign all the way back in 2016. So I guess my question is, A, how do you feel about that? But B, how do you combat this? I think that there's a sense that perhaps Hillary Clinton's campaign fell into some traps and was unable to dig themselves out of it. How can you acknowledge without falling into those traps yourself?
When that was called to his attention by mainstream press like you, he said, I was only kidding. But what he's trying to do is get something going on the internet. Just try to get it going. Say it enough, like his father says. If you say it enough, people will believe it.
Well, it's a pretty pointed joke, if it is a joke, and then of course
it's sick. It's sick. But he is his father's son.
So are you and your campaign just not going to acknowledge those kinds of statements going forward?
No, I don't want to get down in the mud with these guys. I mean, look, people know who I am. The good news is the bad news. They know me. They know my faults. They know my talents. They know me. So it's hard to lay on me some of the things that are just totally out of sync with anything in my whole life that anyone has ever said in their life. But this is bizarre. Think about that. Think about the idea that when I sit down on the floor with the kids that want to talk to me, and I'm sitting on the floor during a conference, and they says, well, God, that Biden, I don't know, man, look at around those kids. I mean, Jimmy, God almighty, this is sick. I mean, it just, I just don't, they never fail to amaze me how venal and, well, I don't want to get going because I don't want to do what they do.
Let's talk campaign politics for just a second here.
Sure.
You mentioned President Obama. President Trump doesn't want to hang his portrait, but it seems that President Obama has entered the 2020 campaign with some gusto. First, in a call with 3,000 members of an Obama Alumni Association, in which he rallied troops to get behind your candidacy. Then over the weekend, in a commencement address in which he strongly implied that the Trump administration doesn't know what it's doing. You must be pretty glad to have him back, first of all. So why don't you make a little news here? Will you be on the virtual campaign trail with him anytime soon? And do you have any events planned?
Well, look, when I ran, I don't think any of you believed it. When I ran, I asked him not to endorse me. Everybody said, oh, and that's not true. That's not true. He just doesn't know whether he wants to endorse you or not. I knew it already. We're friends. We're close friends. And we've been great partners. And the presidential and vice presidential historians have said there's been never a president and vice president closer than he and I, because we trusted each other completely. And I still trust him. When the president says things and goes after the former president with Obamagate, my God. And you even have the attorney general saying he has no intention of going into an investigation on Obamagate. I mean, this is his attorney general who is, anyway. So I never doubt it. And I said at the time, once I'm the candidate, once I win the nomination, I'm sure Barack is going to be fully behind me.
But you don't expect to do any campaign events with him or for him to formally endorse you until the convention.
No, he has formally endorsed me. He formally endorsed me in a big way, and he's done virtual events for me already. And I expect to campaign with him when we're able to campaign, because I think I'm very proud to have been his vice president. Very proud of the job we did on foreign and domestic policy. And so, but as he says, what I've been saying all along. It's not enough to go back to what it was. We have to do better because things have changed. We're in a very different situation. The next president of the United States is going to find himself with a world in disarray where we're no longer respected very much around the world and a nation that's divided. And they're going to have to be able to both, when they stand on that platform on the 21st of January, be able to address the world leaders and say, we're back. This is the United States. We keep our commitments. This is who we are. We keep our promises. This is what we're going to do. Because if we don't, look how frayed the alliances are around the world. And we have to bring the country together. And And I think we can do that. I think you're seeing that kind of coalescing taking place, because some of the stuff that President Trump has said is just so far off the wall. And the way he talks about our allies like they're our enemies, and the way he embraces thugs around the world, and he talks about how this is, I think, not because I'm running, this is the most consequential election you've ever voted in your whole life. A lot's at stake. Former years of Donald Trump, where there will be no Atlantic alliance. Former years of Donald Trump, we're going to see us, America first has made America alone. Did you ever think you'd see the Russian Navy riding alongside of the Iranian Navy in the Persian Gulf, and our allies saying to the President of the United States that, making a moral equivalence between us and Iran? Come on, this is...
Vice President,
Anyway.
I want you to follow up on Brittany's last line of questioning about some of these conspiracy theories. What do we do about all of this misinformation and disinformation and these conspiracy theories that have infected our politics? Aren't you going to have to deal with that? I mean, you remember what happened in 2016?
Yes, I do. But there's two things that have changed. Number one, the American people know who Donald Trump is. His very unfavorable rating is through the sky. He's never broken 50%. It's like when the Carney show goes through town the first time and they find there's no P under any one of the 3 shells that are being used out there. Well, guess what? The Carney show's back. People have figured it out. Now, there are people who are with him and stay with him, somewhere around 30% of a third of the American people. But the nation desperately needs to come together, and they know it. They know it. You remember when I first announced, I said I was running for 3 reasons: restore the soul of the nation, rebuild the middle class, and unite the country. And even my colleagues in the Democratic Party said you can't unite the country. Well, if we can't unite the country, we're dead. Unless you can generate a consensus in America, it becomes just abuse of power. And all of a sudden, guess what's happening? Everybody's talking about the need to unite the country, including many of our Republican colleagues. Look at the Republican governors now. So I think we just have to tell the truth, be authentic, tell people what you're going to do it, and make sure they know that you're going to keep your word. That's an important thing, I think.
And sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Vice President. I'll just do one more news of, and I want to push forward a little bit to what food policy might be looking like and going forward, because we're running out of time here. So I want to ask you just very simply, Mr. Vice President, if you have watched any of Tara Reade's interviews, like the one she did with Megyn Kelly?
No, I haven't, but I've been asked about her.
Why is that?
And, well, I haven't had an opportunity, and I haven't look, here's the deal. Every woman has a right to be heard. Every woman should be able to come forward. Every woman should be presumed that they were telling the truth. And then it should be investigated by serious reporters like you and others to determine what the truth is. And the truth is, this never, ever happened. It never, ever happened. And what I'm reading now online and what I'm seeing in the national press, apparently there's a lot of other people who are wondering whether or not it happened. It's not my role to ascribe a motive to anything she's done or not done, except to assure you, it never, ever, ever happened. That's the truth of it.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I want to, bring Jose Andres back in this a little bit more too. And I want both of you to close your eyes and think of January 2021. Best case scenario for you, you're voted into office, you're at your inauguration, I don't know, the Beach Boys are playing. And I'm curious, since you're both together now, if Chef Andres would have any sort of role to play, whether in a more formal capacity or an informal advisory capacity in a Biden administration. Would you consider appointing him some kind of food policy czar? It's a federal position that isn't really being filled right now.
The answer is I would want his input, I'd want his advice, and I'd want to talk with him about how we increase the notion that in the wealthiest country in the world, no one should be going hungry. No one should be going hungry, period.
Chef, that kind of got me a job offer.
I agree 100% with Vice President Biden. I think right now we cannot get distracted. We have people starving in this pandemic. and I know Vice President Biden is going to be putting food at the center. We need to make sure that food is important in this campaign, because we are understanding that hunger doesn't know political party, race, religion, borders. We have Americans, we the people, that they expect from our leadership the respect they are supposed to get. And sometimes a plate of food is used the way forward. Baran, this philosopher in 1826, he said, the destiny of the nations will depend in how they feed themselves. We need to make sure that we will feed America as America expects, showing respect to the people that produce it, showing respect to the land and to the air and to the water, making sure that children will not be forgotten and we'll always keep them fed, making sure we don't forget our elderly, that right now they are sometimes like the ghosts of the system, and we need to make sure that we take care of them. At the end of the day, food more often than not seems is part of the problem. We need to make sure that leadership shows the way to make sure that food is part of the solution of a better America, of a stronger America.
And a better world. I'm going to empower and I mean this sincerely, like we did in the Obama-Biden administration, empower USAID and the Department of Agriculture to help nations, particularly what we did in Africa, learn how to till the land, know the science of it, increase the prospect of producing for themselves the food that they need. Because what happens? What happens when there is no food? What happens when the climate changes and there's not arable land? There's great migrations. That's the stuff that starts wars. It's overwhelmingly in the interest of the United States for the Department of State through the USAID program to make sure that we help other nations, particularly struggling nations who can't either afford to buy the food and don't know how to produce the food for their own people. It's in the interest. It's not only a humanitarian thing, it is a national security point that will be a major element in my administration. And this president has cut USAID, cut assistance around the world, and it's overwhelmingly in our interest that that not happen.
Mr. Vice President, I want to ask you one last question about the coronavirus crisis, and that is, how is it going to shape your agenda if you become president? We are all living through this crisis, but with crisis comes opportunity. And I guess the question is, are you going to be, you've talked about transforming the American economy. And so very specifically, how are you going to transform this economy? And what are the boldest policy proposals that you are going to push for?
Well, number one, first of all, will be determine what I'm left with on the day that I am sworn in, assuming I win the nomination. Win the presidency. And what that means is that if the president continues to go so slow, we already have 90,000 deaths, and by the time I see you next time, we're going to have 100,000 deaths. It just continues to climb. And so we have to get to a place where we know how to slow this curve, bend it, and do everything we can to get a vaccine. In the meantime, reduce the number of deaths that are out there. I'm going to probably inherit the highest unemployment rate since, and maybe including the Depression. And so the first thing that has to be done is how can we sustain people so that they're not worse off? How do we supplement what they're doing? That's what the Congress has been doing now, and the president's not been getting the money out very well. But then we have to start to rebuild the economy, rebuild it. And the way to rebuild it is to make sure that we're in a position that we take those major initiatives. For example, $1 trillion needs to be spent in infrastructure. It'll create 10 million good paying jobs out there. We have to bring people along. We need a national public health corps. We need community service. We need to move in directions that allow people to be able to get an education. For example, if we invest in schools in zip codes where they don't have much money for their schools, Title I schools, we triple the money spent from 15 to 45 billion a year. We can make sure that every single 3, 4, and 5-year-old goes to school, not to daycare. All the studies show that increases the prospect of getting all the way through school and going beyond by over 58%. We can invest at the other end, forgiving student loans, making sure that people have access. The idea that you can go through the 20th century with just 12 years of education and the 21st century is just not reasonable. So we have to invest in the things that grow our economy. And it gives a gigantic opportunity, creating new jobs, good paying jobs. We're going to be the leader in the world in terms of dealing with the green crisis we have, the climate crisis, with our new green economy. Every new highway we build over the next 10 years, we can put 550,000 charging stations in those highways. So we own the market in electric vehicles. There's so many opportunities if we give people a chance. But mainly, as the word that you used, Chef Andre, the word you used, people are entitled to be treated with respect, with dignity, and given an opportunity. I'll end where I began. My dad used to say, Joey, a job's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about your place in your community. It's about self-respect. It's about knowing who you are. It's about being able to look at your child and say, honey, it's going to be okay, and mean it. Over 50% of the American people for the first time don't believe they can do that now.
Okay, well, last question for the two of you very quickly, which I think is something that all Americans are thinking about. What pre-quarantine activity do you miss the most? Let's start with the chef.
Well, I'm not gonna lie to you. I love scuba diving. I love to be underwater. It's a piece of peace for me, my wife, my children. And I cannot wait one day to go back to Florida, to the Caribbean, and be underwater, enjoying the bounty that the ocean can show us. So that's one that I miss, and I cannot wait.
Vice President Biden?
What I miss most is being able to contact people face to face. The fact is that I learn more by talking to people face to face, hear what there's on their minds, what their emotions are, what worries them, what their concerns are. This is about all our families. I miss being able to be out in the public and going around and seeing people, holding rallies with not just a couple people, but with thousands of people, listening to their concerns and letting them make a judgment about whether or not what I'm offering is real or not, whether they're for it or against it. That's what I miss the most. I miss being able to talk to you guys in person because, it's all about being personal, understanding what people are frightened about. And there's a lot that people are concerned about and a lot they're hopeful about. And there's no better way of knowing it than shaking their hands, looking them in the eye, and letting them tell you what's on their mind. That's how I've related my whole life. The only thing I've ever done from the time I've been a kid is be involved in trying to figure out how I can be a little bit helpful in making things a little better. From starting in the civil rights movement to the environmental movement to being in public office and holding public office since I was 27 years old. And it's about just trying to make things better. And I really mean that. Just making things better for people, because if we can do that, I know my family's going to be better off. My grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. There's nothing we cannot do in this country if we do it together. Nothing. There's nothing that's ever stopped us. This is the United States of America. We're an amazing country. It's time to get up, take it back.
Well, that wraps it up for our town hall this evening. Vice President Biden and Jose Andres, thank you so much on behalf of Brittany Shepard and Yahoo News. Thanks to everybody who tuned in, and good night, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chef.